The sun was just starting to peek over the mountains when Rosa stepped out onto her front porch. She loved this time of day. Everything was quiet except for the gentle sounds of her cattle moving around in the distance. The air was cool and fresh. Nothing like the burning heat that would come later. Rosa had been living on this ranch for 3 years now, ever since her father passed away and left it to her. At first, she wasn't sure she could handle it. Running a cattle ranch by yourself isn't easy for anyone, let alone a single mom with 2 little kids to take care of. But somehow she'd made it work. She walked over to the small fenced area next to the house where her twins were playing. Elena and Diego were only 2 years old, but they were already showing such different personalities. Elena was the quiet one, always watching everything with her big brown eyes. Diego was the troublemaker, always trying to climb over things or stick his fingers where they didn't belong. "Good morning, my babies," Rosa said softly, crouching down to their level. Both kids ran over to the fence, reaching their little arms up toward her. "Mama, Mama," Diego called out. Jumping up and down, Elena just smiled that sweet smile of hers and held up a small toy horse she'd been playing with. Rosa's heart melted every time she looked at them. These 2 little ones were her whole world. The ranch had been in her family for 2 generations. Her grandfather started it back in the 1970s, and her father had spent his whole life building it up. When he got sick, Rosa had moved back home to help take care of him. After he died, she couldn't bear to sell the place. It held too many memories, but living out here wasn't always easy. The nearest neighbor was old Carlos, and his place was about 3 miles down the road. The closest town was almost 20 miles away. When something went wrong, you couldn't just call someone to come fix it right away. You had to figure things out yourself. Rosa had learned a lot in these 3 years. She could fix a broken fence, deliver a calf, and even repair the old truck when it decided to act up. Her hands weren't soft anymore like they used to be when she worked in the city. Now they were rough and strong, with calluses from all the ranch work. The cattle business had been good to her lately. Beef prices were up, and she'd just sold a whole group of steers to a buyer from the next county. The money was sitting in her safe inside the house, waiting for her to make the trip to the bank next week. It was more cash than she usually kept around, but the buyer had insisted on paying that way. As she was thinking about her good fortune, something caught her eye. There were tire tracks in the dirt near the main gate. Fresh ones. Rosa frowned and walked over to get a better look. The tracks were definitely new. She could tell because there hadn't been any rain in weeks, and these marks were clearly made after the last windstorm that had blown dust over everything. But who could have been here? The mailman came on Tuesdays, and this was Thursday. Carlos always called before coming over, and she hadn't heard from him. Maybe someone had gotten lost and turned around in her driveway. That happened sometimes. People would miss the turn to the main road and end up at her place by mistake, but something about these tracks bothered her. They didn't look like they came from someone who was just turning around. They looked like someone had driven slowly up to the gate, maybe even stopped for a while. Rosa shook her head. She was probably just being paranoid. Living alone out here sometimes made your imagination run wild. Every little sound at night made you wonder if someone was outside. Every unexpected noise made your heart race. She walked back toward the house, but stopped when she noticed the twins had gotten unusually quiet. When she looked over at their play area, she saw them both staring toward the main road. Elena was pointing at something, her little face serious. "What is it, baby?" Rosa asked, following her daughter's gaze in the distance. She could just make out a dark-colored truck parked on the side of the road. It was too far away to see clearly, but it definitely wasn't a vehicle she recognized. As she watched, the truck started moving again and disappeared around the bend. A strange feeling settled in Rosa's stomach. Maybe it was nothing, but her father had always taught her to trust her instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. He used to say. She picked up Diego and balanced him on her hip while taking Elena's hand. "Come on, kids, let's go inside and get some breakfast." The kitchen was her favorite room in the house. It was big and bright, with windows that looked out over the pasture. Her father had remodeled it just before he got sick, putting in new cabinets and a big farmhouse sink. Rosa loved cooking in here, especially in the mornings when the light was just right. She put the twins in their high chairs and started making scrambled eggs and toast. Diego banged his spoon against his tray while Elena sat quietly, still holding her toy horse. Rosa tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it wouldn't go away. Maybe she should call Carlos and ask if he'd seen any strange vehicles around. Or maybe she should just drive into town later and mention it to Sheriff Martinez. He was a good man who'd grown up in the area. He knew all the local families and would want to know if strangers were hanging around. But then again, what would she say? That someone had driven past her property? That she'd seen tire tracks? It would sound silly. People had every right to drive on the public roads, even if they were strangers. As she was feeding the twins, Rosa's mind wandered to all the things she needed to get done today. The cattle needed to be moved to the south pasture where the grass was better. There was a section of fence that needed repair after last week's windstorm, and she wanted to clean out the barn before the weekend. The twins were getting bigger every day, and soon she'd need to think about finding daycare or a babysitter so she could spend more time on ranch work. Right now, she did most of the heavy work early in the morning or during their afternoon naps. It wasn't the most efficient way to run a ranch, but it was the only way she could manage as a single mom. After breakfast, Rosa settled the kids in the living room with their toys and cartoons. She stood at the window, looking out at her land. Everything looked peaceful and normal. The cattle were grazing quietly, the chickens were pecking around in their coop, and the old barn cat was sunning himself on the porch. But that strange feeling was still there, like a small voice in the back of her mind telling her to be careful. Rosa had learned to listen to that voice. It had kept her safe more times than she could count. She walked over to the gun cabinet and checked to make sure her father's old rifle was loaded and ready. She'd hoped she'd never need it, but her father had always said it was better to be prepared. Living this far from help meant you had to be ready to protect yourself and your family. Little did Rosa know that this perfect morning was about to become the beginning of the worst day of her life. It was just past 10 in the morning when Rosa heard the sound of a truck coming up her long driveway. She was in the kitchen washing dishes while the twins played in the living room. The sound made her freeze for a moment. She wasn't expecting anyone today. Rosa dried her hands on a dish towel and walked to the front window. A dark blue pickup truck was making its way slowly toward the house. It was the same truck she'd seen on the road earlier. She was almost sure of it. 3 men sat in the front seat, and none of them looked familiar. Her heart started beating a little faster, but she tried to stay calm. Maybe they really were just lost and needed directions. It happened sometimes, especially with people who weren't from around here. The county roads could be confusing if you didn't know them well, but something about the way they were driving bothered her. They weren't moving like people who were lost and looking for help. They were driving slowly and carefully, like they were studying everything around them. The truck stopped near her front porch, and all 3 men got out. Rosa kept watching from the window. The men looked to be in their 30s or 40s. They were wearing regular clothes, jeans, and T-shirts, but there was something about them that made her uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way they kept looking around, or how they seemed to be talking quietly to each other while they approached the house. The tallest one, who seemed to be the leader, knocked on her front door. Rosa took a deep breath and walked over to answer it, but she kept the chain lock engaged so the door would only open a few inches. "Can I help you?" she asked through the gap. "Good morning, ma'am," the tall man said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry to bother you, but our truck broke down about a mile back. We were wondering if we could use your phone to call for help." Rosa looked past him toward their truck. From what she could see, it looked fine. The engine wasn't smoking. There were no visible problems, and they'd driven it all the way up her driveway without any trouble. "I'm sorry, but I can't let strangers into my house," Rosa said politely. "I have a cell phone you can use from out there if you need to make a call." The man's smile faded a little. "Well, the thing is, we don't have cell service out here. We really need to use a landline." That was strange. Rosa knew for a fact that there was cell service in this area. She used her cell phone all the time. And it worked just fine. Why would he lie about something like that? "Look, lady," said one of the other men, stepping closer to the door. "We just need to use your phone for 5 minutes." "What's the big deal?" Rosa didn't like his tone at all. There was something aggressive about it that made her take a step back from the door. Her father had always taught her to trust her instincts about people, and right now her instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. "I'm sorry, but like I said, I can't let you inside," Rosa repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. "You're welcome to use my cell phone from the porch, or you can drive back toward town. There's a gas station about 10 miles that way." Through the gap in the door, she could see the three men exchange glances. The tall one, who'd been doing most of the talking, looked annoyed now, and the other two were starting to look around the property in a way that made Rosa's skin crawl. "You live out here all by yourself?" asked the third man, who hadn't spoken before. That question sent a chill down Rosa's spine. Why would he want to know that? And how would he even guess that she lived alone, unless they'd been watching her place? "My husband will be back any minute," Rosa lied quickly. "He just went to check on the cattle." "Funny," said the tall man, and his fake smile was completely gone now. "Because we've been watching this place for 3 days and we haven't seen any husband." Rosa's blood ran cold. They'd been watching her house for 3 days? That meant they knew her routine, knew when she was home alone with the kids, knew that she really didn't have anyone nearby who could help her. From the living room, she could hear Diego starting to fuss. He was probably getting tired and would need his morning nap soon. The sound seemed to catch the attention of the men outside. "Sounds like you've got kids in there," said the aggressive one. "How old are they?" Rosa's protective instincts kicked in full force. These men were not here because their truck broke down. They were here for something else, and they'd been planning this for days. She needed to get them away from her house and away from her children. "You need to leave," she said firmly, starting to close the door, but the tall man was too fast. He pushed against the door hard, and the chain lock snapped under the pressure. Rosa stumbled backward as all three men pushed their way into her house. "Now that's more like it," the tall man said, looking around the living room. "Much more comfortable in here." Rosa's mind was racing. The twins were right there in the living room, playing with their toys and completely unaware of the danger. Diego looked up at the strangers with curious eyes, while Elena clutched her toy horse and moved closer to the couch. "What do you want?" Rosa asked, trying to keep herself between the men and her children. "Oh, I think you know what we want," said the tall man. "See, we heard you just made a big cattle sale, got paid in cash. We figure a successful rancher like you must keep that money somewhere safe." Rosa's heart sank. Somehow, they knew about the money in her safe. The cattle sale had been legitimate business, but she'd agreed to take cash because the buyer had offered her a better price that way. Now she was regretting that decision. "I don't keep large amounts of money here," she said, which was technically true most of the time. "Come on now, don't lie to us," said the aggressive man. "We know you've got it. Probably in a safe somewhere. Why don't you just tell us where it is and we can all get through this nice and easy?" Elena started to cry softly, sensing the tension in the room even though she didn't understand what was happening. Rosa wanted to go to her daughter, but she was afraid to move away from where she was standing. "Please," Rosa said quietly. "Whatever you want, just take it and leave. Don't hurt my children." "Nobody's going to get hurt if you cooperate," the tall man said. "But if you make this difficult, well, we can't make any promises." The threat was clear, and Rosa knew she was in serious trouble. These weren't just thieves looking for quick cash. They were organized criminals who had planned this carefully. They knew about her money, they knew she lived alone, and they knew she had children who could be used against her. Diego had crawled over to the couch where Elena was crying and was trying to comfort his sister in that sweet way little kids do. The sight of her babies in danger made Rosa feel sick to her stomach. "The safe is in the bedroom," she said quietly, knowing she had no choice but to cooperate. "I'll show you where it is." "That's better," the tall man said. "See how easy this can be?" But Rosa had a sinking feeling that even if she gave them what they wanted, this nightmare was far from over. The way they'd talked about watching her house, the way they'd planned this whole thing. These weren't the kind of men who left witnesses behind. As they forced her toward the bedroom, Rosa caught sight of her father's rifle still locked in the gun cabinet. It might as well have been on the moon for all the good it could do her now. She could only pray that somehow someone would realize she was in trouble before it was too late. Rosa led the three men down the hallway toward her bedroom, her legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. Behind her, she could still hear the twins in the living room. Elena's soft crying had stopped, but she could hear Diego babbling to himself as he played. The innocent sounds of her children made this whole situation feel even more like a nightmare. The tall man stayed close behind her while the other two spread out through the house. She could hear them opening cabinets and drawers, looking through her things. One of them was in the kitchen, and she heard the sound of dishes being moved around roughly. "Where exactly is this safe?" the tall man asked when they reached her. "Bedroom." Rosa pointed to the closet, behind the clothes in the back wall. She watched as he pushed aside her hanging clothes and found the small wall safe her father had installed years ago. It wasn't very big, but it was well hidden and had always seemed secure enough for important papers and the occasional cash she needed to keep on hand. "Open it," he ordered. Rosa's hands were shaking as she turned the combination dial. She'd opened this safe hundreds of times, but now she could barely remember the numbers. Finally, she heard the click and pulled the door open. Inside was the money from the cattle sale, more cash than she'd ever had at one time. There were also some important papers, her grandmother's jewelry and the deed to the ranch. The man reached in and grabbed the money, counting it quickly. "This is good," he said with satisfaction, "but I bet there's more. A place this size, a successful operation like this, there's got to be more money somewhere." "That's all I have," Rosa said honestly. "I don't keep large amounts of cash around normally. This was just from the cattle sale." The man studied her face, trying to decide if she was telling the truth. From the other room, she heard one of his partners calling out, "Hey, boss! Come. Look at this." They walked back toward the kitchen, where one of the men was standing by the refrigerator. Pinned to it with magnets were some photos of Rosa with the twins, but also a newspaper clipping about the local cattle auction where she'd sold her steers. "Look at this," the man said, pointing to the article. "Says here she got top dollar for premium beef." "That's a lot more money than what was in that safe." Rosa's heart sank. The newspaper article mentioned the sale, but it didn't say exactly how much she'd been paid. These men were assuming she had much more money than she actually did. "I told you that's all I have," Rosa repeated. "The money from the sale went to pay bills, buy feed, and cover ranch expenses. What was in the safe is what's left." The aggressive man who'd been searching the kitchen slammed the cabinet door shut. "She's lying. Nobody keeps just that little bit when they make a big sale like this." "Maybe we need to give her some motivation to remember where the rest is," said the third man, and he started walking toward the living room where the twins were. "No," Rosa said quickly, stepping in front of him. "Please don't involve my children. They're just babies. They don't understand what's happening." "Then tell us where the rest of the money is," the tall man said coldly. "There is no more money," Rosa said desperately. "I swear to you, that's everything I have." The men looked at each other, and Rosa could see them having some kind of silent conversation. Finally, the tall man made a decision. "Here's what we're going to do," he said. "We're going to take what we found, and we're going to take you and the kids for a little ride. Give you some time to think about whether you really told us everything." Rosa felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean, take us for a ride? Just a little trip out into the desert?" he said with that cold smile. "Nice, quiet place where you can think real hard about whether there's any more money you forgot to mention." "But I've told you everything," Rosa pleaded. "There's no more money. Please, just take what you found and leave us alone." The aggressive man laughed, but it wasn't a nice sound. "Lady, you really think we're going to just walk away and trust that you won't call the cops the minute we're gone?" Rosa realized with growing horror what they were planning. They weren't just going to rob her and leave. They were going to take her and the children somewhere isolated, and she had a terrible feeling they weren't planning on bringing them back. From the living room came the sound of Diego starting to fuss. It was getting close to his nap time, and he was getting cranky. The sound seemed to annoy the men. "Get the kids," the tall man ordered one of his partners. "We're leaving." "No, please," Rosa begged. "Just leave them here. They're too little." "They won't understand." But the men weren't listening to her anymore. One of them went into the living room and came back carrying Diego, who immediately started crying at being picked up by a stranger. The man was rough with him, holding him like he was carrying a sack instead of a frightened toddler. "Stop, you're scaring him," Rosa cried, reaching for her son. The tall man grabbed her arm and pulled her back. "You'll get to hold him once we get where we're going. Right now, you need to cooperate." Elena was still on the couch, clutching her toy horse and looking terrified. Her big brown eyes were wide with fear, and Rosa could see that she was too scared to even cry. Another one of the men picked her up, and she went rigid with terror. "Please," Rosa whispered, tears starting to fall down her cheeks. "They're just, little babies. Please don't hurt them." "Nobody's going to get hurt if you do exactly what we say," the tall man replied. But his tone suggested that he was making no real promises. They forced Rosa outside toward their truck. The morning sun that had seemed so beautiful earlier now felt harsh and threatening. The cattle in the distance looked peaceful and normal, completely unaware that their owner was being kidnapped along with her children. Rosa looked desperately toward the road, hoping to see Carlos driving by or maybe someone else who could help. But the road was empty. It was the middle of a weekday morning, and there was no reason for anyone to be coming this way. The men made Rosa sit in the front seat between the driver and the tall man, while the other one got in the back with the twins. Diego was crying harder now, reaching for his mother, but the man wouldn't let Rosa turn around to comfort him. "Where are you taking us?" Rosa asked as they started driving away from her house. "Somewhere quiet," the tall man said. "Somewhere you can have some time to think real hard about whether you've been completely honest with us." As they drove down her driveway and onto the main road, Rosa watched her house get smaller in the side mirror. Everything she'd worked for, everything her father had built, was disappearing behind them. But worse than that, her children were in danger, and she had no idea how to protect them. The truck turned onto a dirt road that led deeper into the desert, away from any houses or buildings. Rosa recognized the area. It was empty rangeland that went on for miles without any sign of civilization. Elena had stopped making any sound at all, which scared Rosa even more than Diego's crying. When children went completely silent like that, it usually meant they were too terrified to react. Rosa tried to turn around to check on her daughter, but the tall man pushed her head forward. "Eyes front," he ordered as they drove deeper into the wilderness. Rosa realized that these men weren't planning to let them go. They were taking them somewhere remote where no one would find them, at least not for a very long time. And by then, it might be too late. The truck bounced along the rough dirt road, carrying Rosa and her twins toward an uncertain fate in the vast, empty desert. The truck bounced and rattled over the rough desert road for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 30 minutes. Rosa tried to keep track of where they were going, but all the dirt roads out here looked the same. Miles and miles of empty desert stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional scrub brush or rocky UTCROP. Diego had finally stopped crying from exhaustion, but Rosa could hear his little hiccupi breaths that meant he was still upset. Elena hadn't made a sound since they'd left the house, and that silence was breaking Rosa's heart. Her daughter was probably in shock from all the scary things happening around her. The sun was getting higher in the sky now, and Rosa could feel the heat starting to build even inside the truck. It was going to be another scorching day, probably over 100 degrees by afternoon. Out here in the open desert, with no shade and no water, that kind of heat could be deadly. Finally, the truck slowed down and stopped near a small canyon. Rosa looked around and didn't recognize anything about this place. They were surrounded by rocky walls and sparse vegetation, completely cut off from any roads or trails that people might use. End of the line, the tall man said, getting out of the truck. Rosa's legs were shaking as they forced her out of the vehicle. The man in the back seat handed Diego to her, and she immediately held him close, feeling his little body trembling against her chest. Elena was handed to her next, and Rosa somehow managed to hold both twins while the men got their supplies. Out of the truck, please, Rosa said one more time. Just leave us by the road somewhere. We won't tell anyone what you look like. We won't call the police. Just don't leave us out here. The tall man laughed coldly. Lady, you've seen our faces. You know our truck? You think we're stupid enough to let you go so you can identify us later? One of the other men was unloading rope and some metal stakes from the truck bed. Rosa's stomach dropped when she realized what they were planning to do. You can't just tie us up out here, she said desperately. It's going to be over 100 degrees today. We don't have any water. We'll die out here. Maybe, the tall man said with a shrug. Or maybe someone will find you in a day or two. Depends on how lucky you get. But Rosa could tell from his tone that he didn't expect anyone to find them, at least not in time. This was a death sentence, and he knew it. They forced Rosa to walk over to an old fence post that was sticking up from the ground. It looked like it had been there for years, probably left over from when someone had tried to fence this area a long time ago. The post was weathered and gray, but it was still solid and firmly planted in the rocky ground. Sit down with your back against the post, the aggressive man ordered. Rosa sat down carefully, still holding both twins. The ground was already warm from the morning sun, and she could feel small rocks and thorns through her jeans. Diego snuggled against her, and Elena curled up in her other arm. Finally starting to relax a little now that she was back with her mother, the men began tying Rosa's hands behind the post with thick rope. They wrapped it around several times and tied it tight enough that she couldn't slip her hands free. Then they tied rope around her waist, securing her firmly to the fence post. Please don't tie the children, Rosa begged. They're too little. They don't understand what's happening. We're not going to tie them to the post, the tall man said. But we can't have them wandering off and getting lost. About 20 feet away, there was a natural depression in the ground surrounded by rocks on 3 sides. It wasn't very deep, maybe 3 feet, but the sides were steep enough that the twins wouldn't be able to climb out on their own. The men carried Diego and Elena over there and put them down in what was basically a natural pen. Rosa's heart broke as she watched her children look around in confusion. Diego immediately started crying again and trying to climb up the rocky sides to get back to his mother. Elena sat down in the dirt and hugged her toy horse, which she'd somehow managed to hold on to through everything. Mama! Diego wailed, reaching toward Rosa. Mama! I'm right here, baby, Rosa called back to him, trying to keep her voice calm even though she was terrified. Mama's right here. You stay with Elena, okay? Take care of your sister. The men walked back to their truck and started getting ready to leave. They took all the water bottles from their cooler and poured the water out onto the ground, right in front of Rosa, where she could see it. Can't have you getting too comfortable, the aggressive man said with a cruel smile. You're monsters, Rosa whispered, watching the precious water disappear into the thirsty desert soil. We're practical, the tall man corrected. Nothing personal, lady. You just happened to have something we wanted. They threw some empty food wrappers and bottles around the area, probably to make it look like they'd been camping there if anyone ever found the place. Then they got back in their truck and started the engine. Someone might find you, the tall man called out through the open window. Probably not, but you never know. Stranger things have happened. Rosa watched in horror as the truck drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust that slowly settled over everything. Within minutes, the sound of the engine faded completely, and they were alone in the vast, silent desert. The sun was climbing higher, and Rosa could already feel the temperature rising. By noon, it would be brutally hot. By late afternoon, it would be dangerous. And they had no water, no food, and no way to get help. Diego was still trying to climb out of the rocky depression, his little fingers scraping against the stone as he called for his mother. Elena had started crying quietly, not the loud wails, of a tantrum, but the heartbroken sobs of a child who knew something was very wrong. Rosa tested the ropes around her wrists, but they were tied tight and professionally. These men knew what they were doing. The rope around her waist kept her from leaning forward very far, and her hands were completely useless behind the post. She looked around desperately for anything that might help. There were some sharp rocks nearby, but they were too far away for her to reach. There were a few scrubby bushes, but nothing that looked like it might have any moisture in it. The twins were about 20 feet away from her, close enough that she could talk to them but too far to touch. Diego had worn himself out trying to escape and was now sitting next to his sister, both of them looking toward Rosa with confusion and fear. "It's okay, babies," Rosa called to them, trying to sound confident. "Mama's going to figure out how to get us home. You just stay together and try to rest." But even as she said the words, Rosa knew their situation was desperate. They were miles from any road, tied up with professional knots, and facing a day of deadly desert heat with no water or shelter. She had maybe 24 hours before dehydration became serious. The twins, being so small, would be in danger even sooner. Their little bodies couldn't handle the heat and lack of water like an adult could. As the sun continued to climb, Rosa started working on the ropes with every ounce of strength and determination she had. Somewhere behind the post, there might be a sharp edge or rough spot she could use to cut through the rope. She had to get free. Her children's lives depended on it. The sun climbed higher in the desert sky, and Rosa could feel the heat starting to build around them like an invisible wall. It was probably only 10 in the morning, but already the temperature was rising fast. By noon it would be over 100 degrees, and by afternoon it could reach 110 or even higher. Rosa worked frantically at the ropes binding her wrists, trying to find any weakness or rough edge she could use. Behind the fence post she felt around with her fingers for anything sharp. The old wood was weathered and splintered in places, and she found a spot where a piece of metal wire was sticking out. Slowly, carefully, she began rubbing the rope against the sharp wire. It was awkward and painful work. She had to twist her wrists at an uncomfortable angle, and the wire kept cutting into her skin along with the rope. But she didn't care about the pain. Her children's lives were at stake. Diego and Elena were still sitting in the rocky depression, and Rosa could see they were starting to feel the effects of the heat. Diego's face was getting red and he was breathing harder than normal. Elena was just sitting quietly, still holding her toy horse, but Rosa could see sweat starting to form on her little forehead. "It's okay, babies," Rosa called to them, trying to keep her voice cheerful. "We're going to be okay. Mama's working on getting us out of here." But inside, Rosa was fighting panic. She knew how dangerous the desert could be. Her father had taught her about survival when she was young, back when they used to go camping together. People could die from heat stroke in just a few hours under these conditions, especially small children. The wire behind the post was cutting through the rope slowly, one fiber at a time. Rosa's wrists were bleeding now from the sharp metal, but she barely noticed. She kept working, sawing back and forth, trying to cut through enough strands to weaken the rope. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Rosa felt the rope start to give a little. Not enough to get free, but enough to know she was making progress. She kept working, ignoring the pain in her wrists and shoulders. The sun was getting stronger, and she could feel it beating down on her head and shoulders. She was starting to sweat, which was dangerous because it meant her body was already starting to lose precious water. In the desert, dehydration could happen fast, and once it started, it was hard to recover without immediate help. Diego had stopped trying to climb out of the rocky area and was now just sitting in the shade of one of the larger rocks. Elena had curled up next to him, and Rosa was worried to see that both children were becoming listless. That was one of the first signs of heat exhaustion. "Diego! Elena!" Rosa called out loudly. "Look at Mama. Can you wave at Mama?" Diego looked up and raised one little hand weakly. Elena didn't respond at all, which sent a spike of fear through Rosa's heart. Her daughter was always the quieter one, but this silence was different. This was the silence of a child whose body was starting to shut down. Rosa worked even harder at the rope, ignoring the burning pain in her wrists. The wire was cutting deeper into the fibers now, and she could feel more strands starting to break. But it was taking so long, and the heat was getting worse by the minute. By the time the sun was directly overhead, Rosa estimated it was probably around 105 degrees. The air was like breathing from an oven, and every breath felt like it was burning her lungs. Her shirt was soaked with sweat, and she could feel herself getting dizzy from the heat and dehydration. The twins had both gone completely quiet now, which terrified Rosa more than their crying had. Diego was slumped against the rock wall, his eyes half closed. Elena was lying on her side in the dirt, still clutching her toy horse but barely moving. "Stay awake, babies," Rosa called desperately. "Don't go to sleep. Stay awake and look at Mama." But she could see that they were both struggling. Their little bodies weren't designed to handle this kind of heat without water. If they fell unconscious, they might not wake up again. Rosa felt the rope give a little more, and suddenly her right hand slipped partially free. Not completely, but enough that she could move it a little. She worked frantically to widen the gap, twisting and pulling. Despite the pain, finally, after what felt like forever, her right hand came free. Then her left hand. Rosa's arms were numb from being tied behind her back for so long, and her wrists were cut and bleeding. But she was partially free. She still had the rope around her waist holding her to the post, but now she could reach it with her hands. Her fingers were clumsy and weak, but she started working at the knot. It was tied tight and swollen from the heat, but slowly she managed to loosen it. When the waist rope finally came free, Rosa stumbled to her feet. Her legs were weak and shaky from sitting in one position for so long, and the heat hit her like a physical blow. But she was free, and now she could help her children. She stumbled over to the rocky depression where the twins were. Diego was conscious but barely responsive. Elena wasn't moving at all, and for a terrifying moment Rosa thought, she might be too late. "Elena, baby, wake up," Rosa said, gently shaking her daughter's shoulder. Elena's eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused and glassy. Both children were showing clear signs of severe heat exhaustion, maybe even early heat stroke. Rosa knew she had to find water and shade for them immediately, or they might not survive the next few hours. She managed to lift both children out of the rocky area, though it took all her remaining strength. They were both like little rag dolls, barely able to hold their heads up. Rosa looked around desperately for any sign of water or shelter. The canyon walls offered some shade, but not much. And there was no obvious source of water anywhere. Rosa remembered her father teaching her that sometimes you could find water by digging in low areas, where rainwater might collect underground. With her bare hands, Rosa started digging in the lowest part of the canyon floor. The ground was hard and rocky, and her already injured hands were soon bleeding even more. But she kept digging, driven by desperation and love for her children. "Come on," she whispered to herself as she dug. "Please, let there be water, please." The twins were lying in the small patch of shade she'd found, barely conscious. Rosa could see their lips starting to crack, and their skin was hot and dry to the touch. They were running out of time, and she was their only hope. As the afternoon heat reached its peak, Rosa continued digging, praying for a miracle that might save her children's lives. Rosa's hands were raw and bleeding as she continued digging in the hard desert floor. Her fingernails had already broken off, and her palms were cut from the sharp rocks, but she couldn't stop. Every few minutes she would look over at Diego and Elena lying motionless in the small patch of shade, and the sight would give her new strength to keep digging. The hole was about 2 feet deep now, but still no sign of moisture. Rosa's father had taught her that water could sometimes be found underground in desert washes, but he'd also warned her that it didn't always work. Sometimes you could dig for hours and find nothing but dry sand and rock. "Please," Rosa whispered, as she scraped at the hard-packed earth. "Please let there be water down here." The sun was past its peak now, but the temperature was still over 100 degrees. Rosa's own body was starting to shut down from the heat and dehydration. Her head was pounding, and she was seeing spots in her vision. But every time she felt like collapsing, she would look at her children and find the strength to keep going. Diego hadn't moved in over an hour. His breathing was shallow and fast, and his skin felt burning hot when Rosa touched him. Elena was even worse. Her breathing was so light that Rosa had to put her ear close to her daughter's mouth just to make sure she was still alive. Rosa had tried everything she could think of. She'd torn strips from her shirt to create more shade for the children. She'd looked for any plants that might contain moisture, but everything in this part of the desert was dried out and thorny. She'd even tried collecting her own sweat on pieces of fabric to give the children a few drops of moisture, but there wasn't enough to make any difference. The hole was 3 feet deep now, and Rosa was starting to lose hope. Her arms and shoulders ached from the digging, and she was getting dizzy from the exertion in the extreme heat, but she couldn't give up. As long as her children were still breathing, she had to keep trying. Suddenly, as she scraped away another handful of dirt, she noticed something different. The soil at the bottom of the hole looked slightly darker than what she'd been digging through. Rosa's heart started beating faster as she dug more carefully around the darker area. Then she saw it. A tiny bit of moisture clinging to one of the rocks at the bottom of the hole. It wasn't much, just a few drops, but it was water, real water. "Thank God," Rosa whispered, tears mixing with the sweat on her face. She dug more carefully now, trying not to let any of the precious moisture escape. Slowly, very slowly, a small puddle began to form at the bottom of the hole. It was muddy and dirty, but it was water. Rosa tore another strip from her shirt and dipped it into the tiny puddle. She squeezed the muddy water out of the fabric and onto her finger, then hurried over to Elena. "Come on, baby," Rosa whispered, gently opening her daughter's mouth and letting a few drops of the muddy water fall onto her tongue. Elena's eyes fluttered at the taste of the water, and she made a small swallowing motion. It was the first sign of life Rosa had seen from her in hours. Rosa went back to the hole and soaked the fabric again, then returned to give Diego a few drops. He was more responsive than his sister, turning his head slightly toward the water and trying to swallow. The process was incredibly slow. The tiny puddle at the bottom of the hole would only hold a few tablespoons of water at a time, and it took several minutes to collect even that much. Rosa would soak the fabric, squeeze out a few drops for each child, then wait for more water to seep into the hole, but it was working. After an hour of this careful process, both children were showing signs of improvement. Diego's eyes were opening more frequently, and Elena had managed to sit up on her own for a few minutes. Rosa was being very careful not to drink any of the water herself, even though her own thirst was becoming almost unbearable. Every drop had to go to the children first. They were smaller and more vulnerable, and they wouldn't survive much longer without hydration. As the afternoon wore on, Rosa continued the slow process of collecting water and giving it to her children. The sun was starting to move lower in the sky, which brought some relief from the intense heat, but Rosa knew they weren't safe yet. The tiny amount of water she'd been able to give them was helping, but it wasn't nearly enough. Diego and Elena were still showing signs of severe dehydration. Their lips were cracked, their skin was still hot and dry, and they were both very weak. Rosa kept working at expanding the hole, hoping to find more water. Her hands were so damaged now that she could barely feel them, but she kept digging. Every few minutes, she would collect the small amount of water that had seeped into the bottom and give it to the children. As the sun started to set, bringing the first real relief from the heat, Rosa allowed herself a tiny sip of the muddy water. She knew she needed to stay strong enough to keep taking care of Diego and Elena, and she was starting to feel dizzy and confused from her own dehydration. The water tasted terrible, muddy and gritty, but it was the most wonderful thing Rosa had ever tasted in her life. Just those few drops helped clear her head a little and gave her the energy to keep going. Diego was starting to make small sounds now, little whimpers and sighs that showed he was becoming more aware of his surroundings. Elena was still very quiet, but she was swallowing more readily when Rosa gave her water, and her breathing seemed a little stronger. Rosa looked up at the darkening sky and realized they'd been in the desert for almost 12 hours. Back home, people would be starting to wonder where she was. Her neighbor Carlos might notice if her cattle weren't taken care of properly. But even if someone realized she was missing, how would they ever find them out here in this remote canyon? She thought about the men who had brought them here. By now, they were probably hundreds of miles away, confident that their victims would never be found. They'd chosen this location carefully, isolated, far from any roads or trails and in terrain. That would be almost impossible to search effectively, but Rosa wasn't ready to give up. As long as she could find water for her children, she would keep fighting. The desert night would bring cooler temperatures, which would help all of them recover some strength. And maybe, just maybe, someone was already looking for them. She settled down next to Diego and Elena in the small shelter she'd created from rocks and pieces of her torn shirt. The children were still very sick, but they were alive. And as long as they were alive, there was hope. "We're going to make it," Rosa whispered to them as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Somehow, we're going to make it home." Carlos Martinez had been Rosa's neighbor for 15 years, and he knew her daily routine better than anyone. Every morning at 7, she would let her cattle out to graze in the south pasture. Every evening at 6, she would bring them back in and make sure they had fresh water. Rosa was as reliable as clockwork when it came to taking care of her animals. So when Carlos drove past Rosa's property on Thursday evening and saw her cattle still scattered in the far pasture with no sign of Rosa anywhere, he knew something was wrong. Carlos pulled his truck over and got out to get a better look. The cattle were milling around near the fence line between his property and Rosa's, looking restless and confused. These animals were used to a strict routine, and they clearly expected to be brought in for the evening. Carlos walked over to the fence and called out toward Rosa's house. "Rosa, everything okay over there?" No answer came from the direction of the house, which was unusual. Rosa was always quick to respond when he called out to her, especially if there was any issue with the cattle. Carlos got back in his truck and drove up Rosa's long driveway toward the house. As he got closer, he could see that something was definitely wrong. Rosa's front door was standing wide open, and there were signs of a struggle in the dirt near the porch. "Rosa!" Carlos called out again as he got out of his truck. "Rosa, are you home?" He walked up to the open front door and peered inside. The house was a mess. Furniture was overturned, drawers had been pulled out and dumped on the floor, and there were dishes broken on the kitchen floor. But there was no sign of Rosa or the twins. Carlos's heart started beating faster. He'd known Rosa since she was a little girl, and he'd watched her struggle to keep the ranch going after her father died. She was like family to him, and those two little kids were like his own grandchildren. He walked through the house calling their names, but got no response. In the bedroom, he found the closet torn apart and the wall safe standing open and empty. It was clear that someone had robbed the place, but where were Rosa and the children? Carlos immediately called the sheriff's department on his cell phone. Sheriff Martinez, no relation, despite the same last name, answered on the second ring. "Sheriff, this is Carlos Martinez out on County Road 47. I need you to get out to the Rosa Gonzalez place right away. Something's happened to her and the kids." "What kind of something?" Sheriff Martinez asked, already sounding concerned. "The house has been robbed, the front door's standing open, and there's no sign of Rosa or the twins anywhere. Her cattle are still out in the pasture, and you know Rosa would never leave them out overnight." Sheriff Martinez knew Rosa, too. She'd grown up in the county, and everyone knew she was a responsible rancher who took excellent care of her animals and her property. "I'm on my way," the sheriff said. "Don't touch anything in the house, Carlos. This is now a crime scene." "Sheriff." Martinez arrived at Rosa's ranch 20 minutes later, along with 2 deputies and the county's volunteer search and rescue coordinator. They immediately began documenting the scene and looking for clues about what had happened. The evidence told a clear story. There had definitely been a break-in and robbery. The safe was empty, the house was ransacked, and there were clear signs of a struggle. But the most disturbing part was that Rosa and her children were nowhere to be found. Deputy Lisa Chun found tire tracks in the dirt near the house that didn't match Rosa's truck. The tracks were from a larger vehicle, probably a pickup truck, and they led from the house back toward the main road. "Looks like they might have taken Rosa and the kids with them," Deputy Shun told the sheriff. Sheriff Martinez felt his stomach drop. In his 20 years of law enforcement, he'd seen cases like this before. When criminals took hostages, especially in isolated areas like this, it rarely ended well. "Get on the radio and put out a bolo for Rosa Gonzalez and her 2 children," he ordered. "Send their descriptions to every law enforcement agency in a 100-mile radius. And call the state police. We're going to need help with this." Within an hour, a full-scale search operation was underway. The state police sent a helicopter to search the area from the air, while ground teams began following the tire tracks away from Rosa's property. The tracks led to the main county road, where they disappeared into the regular traffic patterns. But the searchers kept going, checking every side road and dirt track within a 20-mile radius of Rosa's ranch. As word spread through the small rural community, volunteers began showing up to help with the search. Rosa was well liked in the area, and everyone knew her story, a young widow trying to keep her family's ranch going while raising 2 small children on her own. By midnight, there were over 50 people involved in the search. They had organized into teams and were systematically checking every possible location where someone might hide hostages. Abandoned buildings, remote canyons, old mining sites, anywhere that criminals might take victims to keep them out of sight, but the desert around. Rosa's ranch covered hundreds of square miles, and most of it was empty wilderness. Even with helicopters and search teams, finding 3 people in all that vast territory was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Sheriff Martinez coordinated the search from Rosa's house, which had become the temporary command center. He'd called in favors from every agency within 100 miles, and by dawn on Friday they had search teams from 5 different counties working the case. The helicopter pilots were working in shifts, flying grid patterns over the most likely areas where someone might take hostages. But the terrain was rough and rocky, with thousands of places where a vehicle could be hidden from aerial view. Carlos hadn't slept all night. He'd been driving the back roads with several other local ranchers, checking every place they could think of where someone might go to hide. These were people who knew the land better than anyone, and they were determined to find their neighbor and her children. "She's got to be out there somewhere," Carlos said to Sheriff Martinez as the sun came up on Friday morning. "Rosa's a fighter. If anyone can survive something like this, it's her." Sheriff Martinez nodded, but privately he was growing more worried by the hour. They'd been searching for almost 12 hours with no sign of Rosa or the twins. In cases like this, time was critical. The longer the victims were missing, the less likely it was that they would be found alive. The state police had brought in additional helicopters and search dogs, and they were expanding the search radius to cover even more remote areas. But Sheriff Martinez knew they were running out of time. Somewhere out in that vast desert, Rosa and her children were fighting for their lives. And despite all the resources being thrown at the search, they still had no idea where to look. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, bringing another day of dangerous desert heat, the search teams prepared for what might be their last chance to find Rosa and her twins alive. Rosa had been working through the night, carefully collecting every drop of water that seeped into the small hole she'd dug. The desert night had brought blessed relief from the scorching heat, but it had also brought new challenges. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and without proper clothing or shelter, Rosa and the twins were now fighting hypothermia along with dehydration. She'd done her best to keep the children warm, using her torn shirt to create a makeshift blanket and huddling close to them throughout the long, cold hours. Diego and Elena had slept fitfully, their little bodies still recovering from the trauma of the previous day. As dawn approached, Rosa could see that the tiny water source was becoming even more precious. During the cool night hours, slightly more moisture had collected in the bottom of the hole, but she knew that once the sun came up, the evaporation would increase and the seepage would slow down again. She gave the children a few more drops of the muddy water, grateful to see that both of them were more alert than they'd been the day before. Elena even managed to say, "Mama," in a weak little voice, which brought tears to Rosa's eyes, but Rosa knew they weren't out of danger yet. The small amount of water she'd been able to find was helping, but it wasn't nearly enough for long-term survival. And once the sun came up, they'd be facing another day of deadly heat. As the sky started to lighten in the east, Rosa heard something that made her heart skip a beat. It was a distant sound, barely audible but unmistakable, the rhythmic chopping of helicopter blades. Rosa looked up at the sky, searching for any sign of the aircraft. The sound seemed to be coming from the north, but it was still too far away to see anything. She started waving her arms frantically. Even though she knew the helicopter was probably too far away to spot her, the sound faded away, and Rosa's heart sank. But then, a few minutes later, she heard it again, this time coming from a different direction. Someone was definitely searching the area. Rosa looked around desperately for anything she could use to signal the aircraft. She found some pieces of light-colored rock and arranged them in a large X pattern on the floor of the canyon. Then she took off her white undershirt and tied it to a stick, creating a makeshift flag. The sound of the helicopter came and went several times over the next hour. Each time, Rosa would wave her flag and shout as loudly as she could, but the aircraft never seemed to come close enough to spot them in the canyon. Rosa was starting to lose hope when she heard the helicopter approaching again, this time from the east. But something was different about this pass. The sound was getting louder and staying loud, as if the aircraft was flying lower and slower than before. Suddenly, Diego started crying. It wasn't the weak whimpering he'd been doing for the past day, but a real, strong cry that echoed off the canyon walls. Rosa's heart leaped. That sound meant her son was getting stronger, but more importantly, the cry seemed to catch the attention of the helicopter pilot. The sound of the rotors suddenly changed, becoming louder and more focused. As if the aircraft was circling overhead, Rosa waved her white flag frantically and shouted at the top of her lungs, "Help! We're down here!" "Help! U.S.?" Elena, encouraged by her brother's crying and her mother's shouting, found her voice too. Her weak little cry joined Diego's, and together the children made enough noise to be heard even over the sound of the helicopter. The aircraft appeared over the rim of the canyon, flying low and slow. Rosa could see the pilot's face through the windscreen as he spotted them and immediately began radioing for help within minutes. The helicopter had landed in a flat area about 100 yards from the canyon. 2 paramedics ran toward Rosa and the children, carrying medical supplies and water. "We've got them," one of the paramedics shouted into his radio. 3 victims, all alive, but they need immediate medical attention. The paramedics quickly assessed Rosa and the twins. All 3 were severely dehydrated and showing signs of heat exhaustion, but they were conscious and responsive. The medics immediately started IV fluids and began cooling their bodies with wet towels. "You did an amazing job," one of the paramedics told Rosa as they prepared to transport the family to the helicopter. "That little bit of water you found probably saved all your lives." Rosa was too weak to speak, but she managed to squeeze the paramedic's hand in gratitude. As they loaded her and the children into the helicopter, she looked back at the canyon where they'd spent almost 24 hours fighting for survival. The helicopter lifted off and headed toward the regional hospital, where a team of doctors was waiting to treat the family. During the flight, Rosa learned that dozens of people had been searching for them all night, including her neighbor Carlos and Sheriff Martinez. At the hospital, Rosa and the twins were immediately taken to the emergency room. The doctors confirmed that all 3 were suffering from severe dehydration and heat exhaustion, but there didn't appear to be any permanent damage. With proper treatment, they would make a full recovery. Sheriff Martinez arrived at the hospital within an hour, carrying a folder full of photographs for Rosa to look at. Despite her exhaustion, Rosa was able to give detailed descriptions of the 3 men who had kidnapped them and provide information about their truck. The descriptions Rosa provided matched perfectly with 3 suspects who had been arrested in another county for armed robbery. When police searched their truck, they found Rosa's money and other evidence linking them to the crime. All 3 men were quickly convicted and sentenced to long prison terms for kidnapping, armed robbery, and attempted murder. Rosa's testimony was crucial in ensuring they would never be able to hurt another family. The story of Rosa's survival and rescue made headlines across the region. People were amazed by her determination to save her children and her resourcefulness in finding water in the desert. She became a symbol of maternal love and survival against impossible odds. But for Rosa, the most important thing was that her family was safe. Diego and Elena made full recoveries and grew up healthy and strong. Rosa continued to run her ranch, though she installed a better security system and made sure she always had a way to call for help. The experience changed all of them. But it also proved something that Rosa had always known. There's nothing more powerful than a mother's love for her children. When Diego and Elena were in danger, Rosa had found strength she didn't know she possessed and had literally moved mountains to save them. Years later, when the twins were old enough to understand what had happened, Rosa would tell them the story of their survival in the desert. She would explain how she'd never given up hope, even in the darkest moments, because she knew she had to fight for them. "You two are my whole world," she would tell them, "and there's nothing in this world that could ever stop me from protecting you." The canyon where they'd nearly died remained a powerful reminder of human resilience and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her children. And though Rosa preferred never to return to that place, she knew it had taught her something valuable about the strength that lies within every person when the people they love are in danger.